After Love on the Spectrum, Netflix continues its trend of inclusivity by following the lives of deaf college students attending Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. Deaf U has romance, jealousy, and myths about the deaf community debunked as we follow these young people chasing love and freedom whilst challenging the notion of normalcy. I'm Ronald Young Jr., and I'm on the couch. All right, this is Ronald, and I am on the couch after watching Deaf U on Netflix. Deaf U. Deaf U, executive producers Eric Evangelista, Shannon Evangelista, Nyle Dimarco, and Brandon Panaligan. Starring Cheyenna Clearbrook, Rodney Burford, Tessa Lewis, Alexa Paulay-Simmons, Renate Rose, Daequan Taylor, and Dalton Taylor. All right, so Deaf U, this is a show that Netflix is continuing the trend of doing these kind of unique reality shows. You know, they have The Circle, they have Love is Blind. Then they went through a trend of then of course Love on the Spectrum, Indian matchmaking. So they're really seeking out unique premises or people that we don't often get to hear from, or delving us into worlds that we don't often get to hear from. So here we are delving into a world we don't often get to hear from, no pun intended, when we are following college students at Gallaudet University. Now, these are all young people. These are all deaf people. They're all deaf in some way. One of the first things they explain is that there's the types of deaf people that there are and how they all fit into this world. But at Gallaudet University, which is located here in D.C., many of you guys know I record from Alexandria, Virginia, which is about 15 minutes south of D.C., so I'm in the city quite often. So speaking of DC, one of the things I like about this show is the depiction of DCs. It is one of the first depictions I've seen of people in DC where it's not federal. It's not a bunch of shots of them just, doing political stuff or being on the mall, all that. Now, of course, they have a shot of the Lincoln Memorial in there, which I felt was completely unrealistic because these people went on a date on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial to drink wine and eat pizza, which I was like, I don't know how often that's happening out here, especially since it's not very convenient to get there unless you're walking right up there. And I don't know if you could be drinking on the steps without a park ranger walking up and being like, what are you doing here? So I feel like they had to get special permission in order to do that, especially since they were there at night and nobody else was there. I was like, that seems a little unusual to say the least. Now, you're going to hear me make a lot of little snipes like that because I'm from the region. But that being said, it does make DC look really, really good. I was not aware that DC had as many clubs as I see these young people going to. I keep forgetting they're college age students, so they're in the club all the time. Those days are far behind me, but they seem to find all of them. They're out, they're drinking, they're having a good time. Regular college show, it feels like, in a lot of ways. And then there was a few times where I thought the depictions of DC were a little unrealistic in just in the way that they filmed it, but I don't think it was alienating. And I think for a viewer that doesn't live in this region, they're not going to think the same thing. But when you see people walking around in the Wharf, which is a very nice place, you see the way that they film it. I'm like, I don't know if it's that nice. Which isn't a diss to the Wharf because I love going to the Wharf, but it's one of those things where looking at it through their eyes, it's just like, they filmed this very, very, very nice. But I think they depict it in a way that it's closer to the way that we actually view it. I'm going on a little too much about DC. Let's talk about the show. So these kids are, again, they're in DC and they're kids. They're all like 23, 22, 21. These are young people that are are deaf, and they start the show by just talking about their deafness, what that means, what it looks like. They introduce us to the world. And then after that, them being deaf just, it kind of like fades to the background. Like the way that you notice it is the fact that the entire show is subtitled. When they're signing, all of that is subtitled, and that there's lots of time where people aren't speaking. They're just signing. So if you're in another room and you're listening to someone watch this show, you largely hear people silent. And every now and then somebody, one of the deaf people who speak will talk, and they'll say something on camera, just like a normal reality show. They'll describe something or set up something or talk about what they're doing. And it'll come up. But other than that, there's large swaths of this show that are silent, which means that you can't be looking at your phone and watching the show. This is not a multitask show. You're going to miss stuff because they're sitting around, they're talking, they're interacting with one another. It's all parts that become like very, very important. Now, in terms of you engaging the show and being visual. And I think they do that on purpose because as a hearing person watching the show, I was just like, oh, I see what's happening here. Because I can't just like look away. I have to keep watching the show in order to engage with it, which is a lot of what deaf folks have to do. They have to see you in order to hear what you're saying, either by reading your lips or by watching the signs that you're making. So if they look away from you, they miss everything that you're saying because everything else is largely silent. So you get a lot of that experience watching the show, which I think was a cool effect. I don't know if it was intended specifically for hearing people's experience in that way, as much as they were trying to be as authentic to the deaf community in filming the show. That's probably the more likely answer. But that being said, it ended up being a cool effect, which I really thought was important. Early into the show, I realized that this show like reeks of privilege in a way that it's hard to put a finger on because you're talking about a group of people who are all disabled. But even within that disabled group, it's a completely privileged atmosphere that you have here. For instance, just one right off the back, there's no black women in this show. Not one. There's not one woman of color, of any color besides white. Everybody in the show, all the women in the show are white. There are some black men. Of course, there are white men. And there's one Asian man. Other than that, there are no, when it comes to people, and I was sitting here watching and I remember thinking that's unusual. As a matter of fact, there's two black women on the show. One of them is just at a party. And so she's also a Gallaudet student, but she's just at a party. And I was like, why didn't they follow her? I remember thinking that. I'm like, why not follow her? And then, of course, one of the black men, one of their sisters, is featured later in the show. And she's really just featured having a conversation with him. The cameras aren't really following her. They're following him, and she just happened to be there. So they filmed that conversation. That absence feels significant in a way because what's being explored here is like there's these two black men that are featured on the show and their relationships with white women. And because that's who they're dating and that's who's on the show, which feels something I can't put my finger on it. I can't, it's hard to explain why that just seems inherently problematic, even though I'm sure they're depicting a real scenario. And there is a pregnancy scare in this show. There is, people dating multiple people, dating friends, people, women dating, groups in friend groups. And they talk about a lot how the deaf community is small. So in a lot of ways, this show gets almost as messy as The Hills or any other, like a Real World, any other reality shows featuring young people like who are just out there getting it in with one another. And that's one of the ways in which I'm talking about how at some point, the fact that they're deaf kind of just fades away to the background. And you're really just watching a show about young people, pursuing romantic relationships or romantic and amorous relationships with one another. At one point, there's a character named Alexa who we're so focused in on her life that at one point I was like, this could have just been a whole show about her and the guys that she's dating. And in a lot of ways, it felt very feminist in that we were following a woman who like clearly had agency, clearly was dating who she wanted, when she wanted, clearly was the one calling the shots, leaving a string of broken hearts all over Gallaudet's campus, and not really being concerned about people's feelings in a way that if this were a dude, we would have been like, oh, look at this this heartbreaker, they call them F-boys or any of that stuff. I don't think we would call her an F-boy, but there would have been like 100 different things that we would have had for a dude that was doing the same thing. He's a player, he's this, he's that type of thing. And it seems like, and I guess that's what makes this interesting, because it's like, that's a very feminist premise. But at the same time, watching her, I remember thinking, that's not very nice. And I'm fairly certain I would say the same thing of the dudes, because the dudes in this show are also kind of problematic. There's two dudes in particular who keep like not considering themselves to be F-boys, but they're kind of like the worst depictions of black men that I've seen. I mean, in that they are resilient and strong. And again, these are disabled folks. So it's hard for me not to remember, like, yes, they've overcome challenges and they're doing a good job. They're in college, but in their interactions with women, you can see all of the problems and all of the cracks and all the stereotypical things that I hate that people say about black men that are shining through these two young men. And I remember they're having a conversation early in the series, and I remember saying, oh no, are you guys the only, and sure enough, they're the only two black men in the show. And I'm like, I don't want this show to revolve around y'all. I don't want this to be a story about two black guys dating around white women and kind of being generally trash about their interactions, not being honest, not being emotionally available, just all of the things that you just don't want people to say about, and I have a vested interest as being a black man. I have a vested interest in the things that people say about black men. So watching it, I immediately get defensive and say, man, I get defensive in a way, not to defend what they're doing, but I get defensive in a way of saying, man, I wish y'all wouldn't do that so people wouldn't say things like that. So I think the fact that I can say that is a testament to the normalness of this show. What I'm really saying is that this show is really showing us that, like, within the deaf community, there are a bunch of people doing all the same things that hearing people are doing. So, but the thing that bothers me about that is this is more making me question what normal is more than it's making me question like how normal deaf people are. Because I think we're watching this and I think I don't know if the producers wanted us to walk away with a sense of saying, hey, look, we're out there living our lives too. Like, it's all good. As opposed to me saying, like, I think all of y'all need therapy. Every single one of y'all needs therapy and counseling on relationship help, because this ain't it. The way y'all are doing it right now ain't it. But then there's another part of me that's like, well, they're in college. Like, of course they ain't got it yet. These are young people. Like, they're in college. Like, this is how it's going to be. So, I mean, if you enjoy that type of thing, it's a very light show. I don't think this show is saying anything that's too deep or too far-fetched for anyone to grasp. I don't think anything like that is happening here. But I definitely think that this show is doing something very easily because of the way that it was created. And when I say that, I mean, even with just the subtitles, the fact that everyone's signing when they talk, all of that, I think. And at some point I'm watching it, and because I'm watching the captions, the signing, I'm barely even noticing it anymore, which I think is kind of a cool effect, but even if it's not intended. So I feel like it's a good show and I liked it. I'd say my critiques are that in some cases, I feel like the episodes are too short. They run between 16 and 21 minutes. There's only 8 episodes. You can watch this in an afternoon easily, just like a long documentary. As a matter of fact, it was kind of irritating that it kept breaking the credits, because I'm like, you guys aren't going anywhere. Like, just keep it going. Like, I'm still sitting on the couch. It was so short. I didn't even get one of those, are you still watching Def U notifications? It just kept going. So yeah, it was a good show. I think I'll probably forget about it if there's a second season. I wouldn't be surprised. I think the storytelling was a little non-linear in some cases. There's an incident that happens in the second episode that is being discussed, that is like strangely discussed again in the 4th episode in a way that, and the way that it was discussed, I was like, we already knew all the details of this situation. So it seems like we're being told the same thing twice. And the questionable nature of what happens. At one point I was sitting there watching, I was like, I don't know how I feel about this. Based on what they're describing, that sounds like it might be some sort of assault. And if you when you watch the show, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But no one ever describes it that way, which, if no one else is describing it that way, far be it for me to be the one to step in to say that. But I would say I felt very uneasy. I felt very uneasy about that after watching it for a while. So, yeah. And I mentioned privilege earlier, but one thing to note is that when they talk about the deaf community and being small and preserving themselves and all that, sometimes the language comes off a little elitist, which again is I'm sure it's a strange thing to hear me say about a group of people who are disabled, but there's still a bit of elitism going on amongst these disabled folks, as in the most privileged in the community are setting what the quote rules are for the deaf community, which is, I mean, it's unusual to say the least that there are rules in the deaf community, or that there's a right or wrong way to be a deaf person. One of the subplots is somebody who tries to upend those rules, or who is constantly kind of saying like, I don't know if I agree with this, or I don't know if that's how I want to live my life. And then basically being warned against that because the quote elites will come after her. Because within the deaf community, there's a group that they call themselves, they are called the elites, which is just, I mean, yeah. And it's all very eye-opening in that way, but I don't know how it's compelling, but I don't know. I don't think if they captured it as much as they should have in order for it to be presented right. Because eventually you talk about the elites early, and the elites are mentioned throughout the series. And then before I know it, the series is over. And because of the way that they told the stories, it felt like the series just ends abruptly with no real resolution. And I don't know if that's because there's more of this show coming out, maybe. But COVID hit, and this first half of all of this seemed like it was filmed before winter break, if I'm not mistaken, winter break 2019. So I liked it. I think I would give this show 3 stars. I think if you like The Hills, if you like the real world, if you like seeing young people have these types of interactions with one another, you're going to like this show. I think you will probably forget about this show. I don't think this show is going to be the hit that people expect it to be. I'm talking about it, of course, but I'm, one guy with a podcast recording in his living room. So I don't know if this is going to be the hit that everyone expects it to be, but I think we're in pandemic. It's fluff. I think it's good to watch right now, and it's interesting, and it's at times compelling, but I just don't know if they completely hit the mark on this one. I would give it 3 of 5 stars. It was good, not great, but it was not bad either. So, and with that, Leaving the Theater is a production of ohitsBigRon Studios. Theme music by the mysterious Breakmaster Cylinder. To find out more about this show and other ohitsBigRon Studios shows, follow me on Twitter and Instagram at ohitsBigRon. That's ohitsBigron. If you like this show, check out our sister show, Time Well Spent. Leaving the Theater will be back soon, but until then, I'll be here on the couch.